Greetings, as today we come to the 18th Sunday, or weekend of the church year. And the readings that we will be listening to, the first comes from the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 1, verses 2, and then chapter 21, verses 21 through 23. So we skip around a little bit there. The second reading, Colossians, chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, and verses 9 through 11. And finally, the Gospel according to Luke, who is, of course, our guide this year, chapter 12, verses 13 through 31. So I thought we'd back up a moment because we're missing the opening lines of chapter 13, just to see what has been left out as we kind of follow the continuity of the gospel this time. In verse 1 of chapter 12, Jesus has warned his disciples about the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. Now, admittedly, in this gospel, the Pharisees do not come out so well, and we've pointed on many occasions that the Pharisees mentioned by the Lucan writer are not the same Pharisees as those whom Jesus would have encountered. Remember that the city of Jerusalem had fallen to the Romans in the year 70, and that many of the parties that had been part of Israel's story prior to that went out of existence, but the one that continued, of course, were the Pharisees. So the Pharisees addressed by Jesus in Luke's story are the Pharisees of the Lucan times. So that would be the Pharisees in the mid-80s. And as we have noted, I think recently, that after the fall of Jerusalem, the Pharisees who emerged as the leading group of Jews had moved their headquarters for safety reasons and practical reasons from the south to the north, and had really set up a kind of home in the city of Tiberias, namely on the Sea of Galilee, and that, of course, had been the city that had been built by Herod Antipas. All right, so all of that is just to say that Jesus accused the Pharisees of hypocrisy. And of course, we know what that meant, that they said the right thing, but often did not act in that way. And Jesus had encouraged his disciples in this opening section not to fear anything, even persecution. And then it gone on, and this is developed in verses 3 through 7 of the opening verse, that everything, every little thing is important, that in fact, there's the phrase that even the very hairs of your head are counted, so that God didn't miss anything. And I guess God had a lot of work to do with people who had a lot of hair, but for those who went bald, I suppose that was easier. But anyway, there's the kind of exaggeration that even the hairs of one's head are accounted for by Jesus. Then verse 11 and 12 point out that you will be dragged before authorities. So who are the authorities? Well, often the authorities might well be the Pharisees. That's why I mentioned all of this. But don't worry about what you are to say, for you will be given words as to what to say by the Holy Spirit. So that's the first part of chapter 12 that we are looking at. Now, as the section that we're looking at begins, chapter 13, an individual asks Jesus to settle an inheritance dispute. Now, he just suddenly appears, and this is kind of introduced or interjected into Matthew's story here. Now, Jesus says to him, Why are you asking me to make a decision here as to what should happen? Now keep in mind that the whole point that's going to be developed, and it's a popular theme of Luke, is greed, that it's a question of greed. Now if one wanted to know what to do with regard to inheritance, well, you would go to the book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament, or in the Torah. And in chapter 21 of Deuteronomy, it tells what and how an inheritance should be given. So I think it's kind of interesting. Just kind of review what Deuteronomy says. It says, a double portion of the property of the man who dies goes to the firstborn. All right? Now, if a man dies without sons, then it goes to the daughters who inherit his property. If he has no daughter, it goes to his brother. If no brothers, then it goes to his father's brothers. If the father has no brothers, then it goes to the nearest relative in his clan. And the daughters who inherit property are to marry within their own tribe, so that the property does not pass into the control of another tribe. So all of that is to say that the tradition had kind of made description as to how an inheritance should happen. Jesus here says to the man who asks him to be, apparently he either doesn't know the law or the rule, to be the arbitrator. Now, arbitrator here may have a little different meaning than we have. Generally meant that it was a divider. The arbitrator was a divider, and that Jesus, who has come to reconcile, does not want to be part of something that is going to divide. Now, the key role of the mediator, and this would be the position that Jesus was being asked to take, was to head off blood feuds. That, of course, might be a nice title, because earlier in the other gospel, rather according to Matthew, you remember that in the famous Beatitudes, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. So that's what a peacemaker really meant in terms of, we understand it a little differently, and that's appropriate, but a peacemaker then was one who would head off any division that would take within family. So ideally, of course, the mediator should have been a kinsperson, or at least, and how do you like this, 5 links removed from the disputing party. However, Jesus here doesn't want to become involved in all this, and he adopts, first of all, the customary role of cultural humility. He says, no, I really can't do this. I'm not really a part of this. And secondly, the real reason that Jesus refuses is he suspects that he was going to be drawn into a conflict that would result in greed. So I think all of that is kind of the background for why this person is introduced here into the talk with Jesus, and why Jesus is pictured as saying, no, I don't want to be part of this. Now this is followed, as we will hear, by a parable. This is found in verses 16 through 19. And it's a story in which there is a rich man whose land produces abundantly, so much that he has a tremendous return for the year. And he says to himself, and this will be important to notice, that there is a soliloquy which the man has. This is in verses 17 through 18, where he is pictured as talking to himself. Thank goodness we don't do that. But anyway, and he wants to talk the matter over with himself. I don't know that he had a mirror, but anyway, and he says, now what will I do with all this increase that I got this year? The land has produced so well, and I have a bumper crop. I know what I will do, he says. I will build a bigger building, a bigger tower. I will store all the extra grain that I have, and then I will have plenty, and I won't have to worry, and I will have riches for days to come. Now, just exactly, and there are some questions, of course, that I think we have raised before, but that we would raise here. Now, this, of course, has to do with the fact that the land produced this bumper crop. It might be interesting to notice that it isn't something that the man has done. He hasn't been a good farmer. He has been not out there weeding so that the crop can grow. He hasn't been out there every day watering so that it has enough. He's done none of that. The whole process of growth has been mysteriously the work of God. And see, and that perhaps is what lies behind this particular parable. Good crops, and of course Israel enjoyed that. That would be a year in which there would be sufficient rain, etc. Good crops were the gift of God. It wasn't something that human engineering, or as modern farmers today might be able to do, irrigation, etc. No, that wasn't what happened. It was simply the wonderful works of God. So if there was a bumper crop, it was indeed truly a gift that God had given to this particular field or to this particular man. Now, the fact that he's going to store, first of all, he's got to build a place to store it, and then he's going to store it. And what's he going to do with it? He doesn't need it himself. One might see some overtones here to a story found in the book of Genesis, in the story with regard to Joseph. You remember when Joseph had interpreted the dream of the Pharaoh and had said, well, you're going to have 7 bad years and 7 good years. The good years would precede the bad years. Take the grain, store it, and then, and here's what Joseph in the Genesis story had said, then we will sell it to not only fellow Egyptians, but also to other people who will come. And so there will be a profit made. Now notice the theme here of greed is the factor that lies behind this. All right, so that's what this guy is thinking. I will store the extra grain that I have. I will keep it until such time, and he perhaps projected a little bit into the future, that maybe there won't be so many bumper crops of good. People may find themselves without food immediately available because the crop didn't turn out so well that year. And then they will come to me, and I will sell it to them, and I will, of course, profit. So keep in mind that throughout this whole gesture, you have a teaching that is firm in Luke's story, and that certainly Jesus is pictured as being opposed to, namely greed. So the idea that the man says, well, I will tear down the barns I have and build larger ones, might be a play on a thought that is found in the prophet Jeremiah, who talks about tearing down and building up. But for Jeremiah, it would be accomplished for God's purposes. So the reason why we would tear something down was that God's goodness would be revealed in the new building up that would take place. So although that certainly might be part of the thought that Luke has in mind in remembering the story. The purpose of the man here is not to do something for the good of God, but to his own good. Also notice that in this little parable, the man talks, as I mentioned, talks to himself, but it is I. He takes credit for what has happened. As we have noticed, the bumper crop is the result of God's graciousness. But in some ways, it seems that he's saying, well, maybe I deserve this. Now, this, of course, is tricky because, as we have noticed on other occasions, those who are blessed with riches, and in this case, a bumper crop is certainly considered to be a wonderful richness, were considered to be blessed by God, that it was God's wanting them to be successful and to achieve. And so rich people, and in this gospel, it isn't that rich people are the bad persons, but it is what one does with the riches that one has that is important. So in this case, the rich man says to himself, this is what I will do, and this is how I will use the crop that I have received, and this is when and why I will do it. So one notices here, as we suggested, that it is all very much centered on the individual guy, okay? So all of that is background. Another thought that if he were smart enough, that he would, rather than store it, the man could have taken the harvest that he had in his property, the richness, and given it away to others. In this way, he will develop the pattern, which we noticed on another occasion. He would have become a patron. In other words, by distributing food to others, in a certain way, as I suppose today we would call it, he had a chip that he could kind of cash in at a certain time if he needed it. So here, he would be considered to be a good guy, and in fact, he might even select who his clients would be, whom he would help. And that would improve his status, but it would also improve his relationship with not only those whom he helped, but even perhaps with those whom he didn't. A good steward, and that of course is an image that Luke pictures Jesus as teaching, a good steward uses well the gifts he has for the sake of others. So once again, the whole background to all of this is not that the riches are bad, but rather it is what one does with the riches, as we've noticed. And I think it's important maybe to stop a moment and refer again to the fact that many interpreters today, although this is a relatively, I think, a more recent development, that the audience to whom Luke writes or gives his gospel, writes his material, were indeed rather well off. That he was not talking about people who were poor in the sense that financially they, or however you want to look at that, were not doing so well, but rather we're talking about people who had wealth, therefore who could be patrons, and who therefore had clients. So again, even the audience, I suggest of Luke ought to be kept in mind here. All right, so all of that are some possibilities as to what the man might have done with the rich harvest that not he had produced, but that had God produced. And so, as the parable now continues, it is pictured, and this, by the way, is the first time in any parable that God intervenes. And so at this point, God says to the man who is talking about saving and building and all of that, this night your life will be taken from you, will be asked of you. And then, and here's the point, where will all this wealth and riches go? So he's saving it all for, we would say, a rainy day. He's saving it all so that he will be in a position of riches, and in a certain way of power. Keep in mind that the patron had power, the client had to rely somewhat on the patron's goodwill, will all be lost. And now again, here comes the question of inheritance. So that may well be why the first part of this section of Luke's story includes this parable. So where you plan on it, you save for the rainy day, you hope that maybe you'll get some benefit about using this all for your own sake, etc., wiped out by the fact that you don't exist anymore. So it's a kind of very subtle, isn't it, conclusion here. All of that, this belongs to God, and all this haggling over it that you make will make no sense at all. So, greed. And we have noticed on certainly many occasions, Jesus tells stories that involve greed and involves money, as we said, but there are a number of noble characters, and we have looked at some and we'll look at some as the Lucan story unveils this time, who very nicely use the wealth that they have for others. Might call the fact that Abraham, of course, in the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament, was very wealthy. Okay, you think about the fact we're not talking about a poor man, and although his story occasionally plays a role in the first reading, although not this time, has great wealth, and so great a wealth that when they come into the promised land, he has to divide, and he gives to his nephew Lot part of the territory and keeps part to himself. So a willingness to share his possessions with others. And I think you can find a number of persons in the Hebrew Bible where this idea of sharing what one receives from God with others is very, very important. It will come up later in this year that we have the story of Zechariah, who was the rich man, climbs a tree to see Jesus, comes down, and he says, well, I give half to the poor, and if I have cheated anyone of anything, I give him four times as much. So there are a number of money stories in Luke's account in which greed is to be avoided and goodness is to be shared. The first reading comes from the book of Koheleth. There's only really a little bit chosen here. The book of Koheleth, some say, is perhaps one of the more, it's certainly not a terribly positive book, although in more recent times, because of song and even use in liturgy, certain sections of the book of Ecclesiastes has been used. Koheleth is his Hebrew name. And one of the more popular sections of Koheleth is the fact that there is a time. There is a time for this and a time for that, a time for peace, a time for war, a time for crying, a time for laughing. And that little section, which is found in chapter 3 of the book of Ecclesiastes, is used. But perhaps the section is chosen this time because of the phrase that is used, vanity of vanity, and all is vanity. Now, in Hebrew, the word is hebel, H-E-B-E-L, vanity. And the word vanity, or hebel rather, can be translated in a number of different ways. It can be translated as futility, as absurdity, as meaninglessness. It can also be interpreted as breath. And so that all life, in that sense, is breath or mist. And therefore, when you lose your breath, now we kind of smile, think about that. If you run too much or climb too many steps, depending on your age, you come out of breath. So breath is certainly life-giving, life-supporting. But from the viewpoint, I think that this is chosen, this little section here, that the idea of vanity and vanity, you save all this stuff, you do all this work, you try to make all these kind of gains in life. And again, I think the way in which the passage is being used this time for our reflection is to reflect on what greed is. So you achieve all of this kind of fame, popularity, wealth, position in life, and then you die. And like the vapor, it's gone. And in some ways, forgotten. So, and you can kind of see, I suppose, why Kohelet is considered to be one of the more pessimistic of writers, okay, in the Hebrew Bible. Because, not that these things are important, but he's saying if you're doing it for the future, it's not too smart. I was going to say it's stupid, but it's just not going to work. And when you do save up all this stuff, and this brings us back to the point that we began with this time, if you do save up all this stuff and you do have a lot of treasure and you do have a lot of goods, and then you're wiped out like the breath, who gets it? Who gets what is left? And the truth of the matter is sometimes those who get what is left may not necessarily be the ones who most need it. Isn't this interesting? That wealth is important and should be used in such a way that everyone benefits. Now, I just conclude by remembering something that we talked about earlier on, and that again is underplayed in this story. There is only so much wealth to go around. In the world of limited resources, and that was the world thinking of the first century time, there only was so much wealth, okay? So if one person grew wealthier, it meant, like, as I use the example very often, like the $1. If you had 50 cents and everybody else had a penny, that if suddenly you got 52 cents, then some other group lost. You see, that two of those pennies went to him, but someone else, some other group, didn't have them. So that's the very limited way of thinking. And finally, just as a thought here, remember that the land, in the thinking of the scripture, belongs to God. God is the creator. God is the one who has allowed the good harvest to happen. God is the one who provides the foods that are necessary for people to live. Keep in mind that just earlier on in this gospel, when Jesus had taught his disciples how to pray, he had said, one of the prayers, give us this day our daily bread. Daily meant every day, bread meant food. And so, once again, important to notice that this wonderful, bounteous harvest that the man thought he could benefit from exclusively missed the point. So all of those are some thoughts to keep in mind as we this time look at this story. Indeed, greed, happily, right? No, doesn't belong to our time. But how the goods of this life are used and shared is important. And perhaps we are reminded of this as frequently we notice how many people throughout the planet do not even have not enough food for the upcoming evening meal, that those who have continue need to share, and that therefore greed needs to be reduced as at whatever level and at every level that it can be. Thank you for being with us, and hope to see you again.